Commander Zixthera pressed her six-fingered hand against the gaping wound in her side, watching her violet blood seep through the spaces between her claws. The bridge of the Eternal Vigilance flickered with dying emergency lights, casting eerie shadows across the bodies of her crew. Through the cracked viewport, she could see the writhing mass of devourer ships, descending like a plague of metal locusts upon what remained of the Kethmori fleet. Her people had held this sector for 3,000 years. The Kethmori were known throughout the galaxy as master tacticians, their crystalline minds capable of calculating battle probabilities with devastating accuracy. Their ships were works of art, sleek vessels that danced through space with a grace that had made them legends. Their warriors were trained from birth in the ancient ways of honorable combat. None of it had mattered against the Devourers. The insectoid nightmare race had swept through Kethmori space like acid through silk, consuming everything in their path, entire planets stripped bare in days. Fleets that had never known defeat scattered like leaves before a hurricane. The proud Kethmori civilization, which had once mediated disputes between star systems and brought peace to countless worlds, was dying in screams and silence. Zixthara forced herself to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. The ship's gravity generators were failing, making her feel impossibly heavy one moment and weightless the next. Through the static-filled communications array, she could hear the final transmissions from her remaining ships. They're through our shields. They're through our... The transmission cut to silence. Retreat. All ships retreat to... Another voice lost to the void. Tell my children I... Static swallowed the last words of Captain Mordak, whom she had known since their academy days. Each lost transmission felt like a blade twisting in her hearts. 3 organs that had beat in perfect rhythm for over 2 centuries, now struggling to keep her consciousness intact as her life force drained away. She had outlived her mate, her offspring, her entire bloodline. She was the last of the old guard, the final keeper of memories that would die with her. The main screen still functioned, showing her the tactical display that told the story of her people's end. 17 red dots remained of what had once been a fleet of 300. As she watched, another winked out of existence. Then another. The Devourers were methodical in their destruction, leaving nothing behind but empty space and bitter regret. Her communication officer, young Vextar, had died at his station with his hands still on the controls, trying to coordinate a defense that everyone knew was hopeless. His carapace had been cracked open by Devourer bioweapons, but he had kept working until his last breath. They all had. The Kethmori way was to face extinction with dignity, even when dignity was a luxury they could no longer afford. Zixthara dragged herself to the command chair, her royal purple carapace leaving a trail of luminescent blood across the deck. The chair that had been her throne among the stars now felt like a funeral pyre. She activated her personal log, knowing it would likely be the last record of her people's final hours. Personal log of Commander Zixthera, last of the 100 families, final keeper of the Crystal Archive. Her voice was steady despite the pain, trained by generations of ceremony and protocol. The Kethmori resistance has failed. Our fleets are broken. Our worlds are silent. The Devourers have taken everything. She paused, listening to the sound of her ship's hull buckling under the assault. The Devourers were boarding now, their acidic cutting tools eating through the titanium crystal composite like it was soft fruit. Soon they would be here, and her death would be as meaningless as all the others. But she had one last duty to perform. To any who find this record, she continued, know that we fought with honor. We held the line for as long as we could. We were not cowards. We were not weak. We simply faced an enemy that consumed everything it touched, leaving nothing behind but hunger for more. The ship shuddered as something massive struck the hull. Devourer bioships didn't just destroy their targets, they fed on them, converting matter into more soldiers for their endless swarm. She could hear them now, chittering and clicking as they carved their way toward the bridge, the sound of inevitability. Through the chaos, her mind wandered to the stories. Every species had them. Whispered tales of the creatures that lurked beyond the rim of known space. Humans, the apex predators that even the Devourers feared. Stories of ships appearing from nowhere, of battles that ended before they began, of an entire race so violent and unpredictable that they made the insectoid swarm look peaceful by comparison. The Galactic Council had spent centuries debating whether humans were real or just a convenient legend used to frighten children. No one had ever made confirmed contact. No wreckage had ever been found. No evidence existed beyond scattered reports from the Outer Rim, tales told by frightened refugees and shell-shock survivors who claimed to have seen the impossible, ships that moved like predators, weapons that defied known physics. and warriors who fought with a brutality that made the Devourer's consumption look merciful. Humans were the monsters that ate monsters, the darkness that even darkness feared. Every civilization told their children that if they were very, very bad, the humans would come for them in their sleep. Zixathara had never believed the stories. Her people were rational, logical, scientific. They dealt in facts and evidence, not fairy tales and superstition. But as she sat dying in the wreckage of everything she had ever known, she found herself hoping the legends were true. If humans really existed, if they really were the nightmare predators the stories claimed, then perhaps they would find the Devourers. Perhaps they would do to the insectoid swarm what the swarm had done to everyone else. The boarding sounds were getting closer. The temperature was rising as Devourer bioweapons burned through the final barriers. She could smell the acrid stench of their metabolic processes, like rotting meat mixed with industrial acid. Her people had developed enhanced senses over millions of years of evolution, and now those same senses were forcing her to experience every detail of her impending death. She thought of her daughter Silmara, who had died defending the third moon of Kethmora's prime. Her brilliant child, who had discovered 7 new mathematical principles before her 20th birth cycle, reduced to atoms by weapons that turn matter into energy and energy into more weapons. She thought of her mate, Torgan, who had led the evacuation fleets and bought precious time for civilians to escape. Time that had ultimately meant nothing, as the Devourers had followed the refugees to every sanctuary and consumed them all. The bridge doors began to glow red-hot. They would be through in moments. Zixthara closed her eyes and began the death song of her people, a harmony that had been sung for over 1,000,000 years whenever the Kethmori faced their end. Her voice, trained in the classical methods, filled the dying ship with beautiful, haunting melody. If these were to be her final moments, she would face them as her ancestors had taught her. From crystal light we came, to crystal light return, she sang, the ancient words flowing like water over stone. Our thoughts become the archive, our memories the eternal pattern. Death is but a doorway, consciousness but a song that echoes through time. The doors exploded inward, showering the bridge with molten metal. The first Devourer through was a soldier class, its mandibles clicking with anticipation as it scanned the bridge for living tissue to consume. Its compound eyes fixed on her immediately, and she could see her own image reflected thousands of times in those horrible facets. Behind the first came others. Workers, drones, a massive warrior class whose bioweapons were already spinning up for the kill. They moved with the horrible coordination of a hive mind, each individual part of a greater whole that existed only to consume. They had no art, no culture, no beauty. They were hunger-given form, emptiness-wearing flesh. Zixthara continued her death song even as the Devourers approached. Her voice never wavered, never broke, never showed the fear that was eating at her consciousness like acid. This was what it meant to be Kethmori. This was the dignity her people had maintained for 3,000,000 years of existence. The soldier class raised its primary bioweapon, a living cannon that fired concentrations of digestive enzymes designed to liquefy prey from the inside out. Zixthara met its compound gaze without flinching. She had been a warrior for 2 centuries. She had led fleets across the galaxy. She would not beg, would not plead, would not give these creatures the satisfaction of seeing her break. Our love transcends the flesh, she sang, reaching the final verse. Our bonds survive the grave. We are eternal, we are infinite, we are... The bioweapon fired. Pain exploded through her nervous system as the enzymes began their work. Her enhanced biology, designed to survive in the vacuum of space and resist most toxins, was helpless against weapons specifically evolved to break down sentient life. She could feel herself dissolving from within, her consciousness fragmenting as her neural pathways burned. But she kept singing, even as her voice became a whisper. Even as her vision blurred and her thoughts scattered like leaves in a cosmic wind, she finished the death song. It was the last gift she could give to her people, the final proof that the Kethmori had faced extinction without losing themselves. We are forever, she whispered, and closed her eyes. Darkness took her. The kind of absolute final darkness that comes when consciousness ends and the universe continues without you. She felt herself falling through layers of memory and dream, her sense of self dissolving like salt in an ocean of nothingness. This was death. This was the end of everything she had ever been or ever could be. Somewhere in the distance, impossibly far away, she thought she heard something. Not the chittering of devourers or the death screams of her people, but something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like engines? The deep thrumming roar of massive drives pushing ships through space at impossible velocities. But that was impossible. Her fleet was destroyed. No one was coming. No one had ever come for the Kethmori in their thousands of years of existence. They had always stood alone against the darkness, and they had finally lost that stand. The sounds grew louder, closer. And with them came something she had never heard before in all her years of warfare, the screaming of devourers in pain. The bioweapons that had torn apart her people were firing, but not at her, at something else. Something that was fighting back with terrifying effectiveness. Through the growing din of battle, she heard a new sound that made her dying consciousness freeze with recognition. Energy weapons. Not the organic biocannons of the Devourers or the crystal-based technology of her own people, but something entirely different. Something that crackled with barely controlled power and fury. Human weapons. The stories were true. The legends were real. Somewhere in the galaxy, there really was a race of creatures so violent and unstoppable that they could make the Devourers flee in terror. And they were here, in this system, fighting the battle that her people could not win. But why? What did they want? What could possibly motivate them to involve themselves in a war that had already been decided? Did they have some territorial claim on the sector? Were they hunting the Devourers for their own dark purposes? As consciousness finally faded completely, Zixthera heard one last sound that would haunt the boundary between life and death. The sound of something landing on her ship's hull. Heavy footsteps that moved with purpose and urgency, heading directly for the bridge. Heading for her. Consciousness returned like dawn breaking over a crystal mountain, slow and filled with impossible colors. Zixthera expected the bitter cold of space, the acidic burn of devourer digestive enzymes, or the simple absence that comes with death. Instead, she felt warmth. Real warmth, not the artificial heat of failing life support systems, but something organic and comforting. Her 3 hearts were beating. That was the first miracle. They should have stopped when the bioweapon dissolved her neural pathways, but instead they pulsed with a steady rhythm that spoke of healing, not dying. Her consciousness felt different too, sharper somehow, as if filters had been removed from her perception of reality. She tried to open her eyes but found her eyelids impossibly heavy. Her body felt strange, wrapped in something soft that definitely wasn't Kethmorian medical equipment. The sensation was entirely alien, yet somehow soothing in a way that made no sense. Nothing about devourer feeding procedures involved comfort or healing. Sound came next. Not the chittering of insectoid hunters or the dying screams of her people, but something she had never heard before. A low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It took her enhanced auditory processing several moments to identify it as breathing. Someone was breathing near her, slow and measured, as if they were sleeping. That was impossible. The Devourers didn't breathe. They absorbed atmospheric gases through specialized pores in their carapaces, a silent process that produced no sound. Her own people breathed through dual respiratory chambers that created a soft whistling noise. This was something else entirely, deeper and more primal. Memory began to return in fragments. The final battle. The death of her fleet. The boarding of her command ship. The bioweapon that should have dissolved her from within. She remembered singing the death song of her people. Remembered closing her eyes to embrace the extinction that had claimed everything she had ever loved. But she was alive. Impossibly, inexplicably alive. The surface she was lying on was soft, yielding in a way that spoke of advanced medical technology. But the texture was wrong for Kethmori healing pods, and far too comfortable for anything the Devourers might use. She tried to move her hand and felt it slide across fabric that was smoother than liquid crystal but somehow warm to the touch. Where was she? What had happened to the Devourers? Why wasn't she dead? Through the haze of returning sensation, she became aware of something else. A presence nearby, close enough that she could feel the subtle vibrations of their movement through whatever she was lying on. Someone was sitting beside her, and from the rhythm of their breathing, they seemed to be in some kind of meditative state. Fear should have flooded her system. Every instinct developed over millions of years of evolution should have been screaming at her to flee from this unknown entity, but instead she felt something unprecedented in her experience. Safety. As if whatever was watching over her meant no harm, despite being powerful enough to have rescued her from certain death. She forced her eyes open. The first thing she saw was a ceiling made of materials she didn't recognize, smooth and white, with an almost organic quality that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The illumination was gentle, nothing like the harsh emergency lighting of a damaged ship or the sickly bioluminescence of devourer vessels. This was light designed for comfort, for healing. Turning her head took enormous effort, but she managed to rotate her vision toward the source of the breathing. What she saw there made her 3 hearts skip in unison, not from fear but from sheer impossibility. A human was sitting in a chair beside what appeared to be a medical bed, his chin resting on his chest in sleep. She could see his face clearly, and it was everything the legends had described and nothing like them at the same time. The features were sharp and angular, clearly evolved from predatory stock. His skin was the color of desert sand, and his hair was dark as the void between stars. But he looked young. Younger than she had expected from the stories of humanity's ancient and terrible civilization. His face had an almost innocent quality that conflicted completely with everything she had been told about his species. This was supposed to be one of the monsters that made the Devourers flee in terror, yet he looked peaceful in sleep, almost vulnerable. He was wearing what appeared to be some kind of uniform, dark blue with silver markings that probably indicated rank or specialization. The material looked practical rather than ceremonial, designed for function over display. At his side was a weapon unlike anything in Kethmori or Devourer arsenals, something that seemed to bend light around itself and hummed with contained energy. As she watched, fascinated despite her fear, his breathing changed. The deep, measured rhythm of sleep shifted to the quicker pattern of awakening consciousness. His eyes opened, and for the first time in her life, Zixthara found herself looking into the gaze of humanity's apex predator. The stories had described human eyes as burning pits of rage and hunger, windows into souls that knew only violence and consumption. What she saw instead were eyes the color of Earth's sky, blue as ocean she had only heard about in ancient texts. They were alert and intelligent, scanning her condition with what appeared to be genuine concern. When he realized she was awake, his expression changed to something she couldn't identify at first. Relief? Satisfaction? It took her several seconds to recognize it as joy, pure, uncomplicated happiness that she had survived whatever had happened to her. He leaned forward slowly, obviously trying not to startle her. When he spoke, his voice was nothing like the howling war cries described in the legends. It was gentle, careful, with an accent she had never heard but somehow found pleasant. "Hey there," he said, and the simple greeting contained more warmth than she had experienced in years of military protocol. "You're safe now. My name is Marcus Chen, Lieutenant Commander of the Terran Defense Force." "Can you understand me?" She tried to respond and found her voice box wouldn't cooperate. The bioweapon should have destroyed her ability to speak, should have dissolved the delicate structures necessary for communication. Yet she could feel them working, could sense that her vocal cords were intact and functional. Marcus seemed to understand her difficulty. He reached for something beside the bed and she tensed automatically, expecting pain or restraint. Instead, he brought up a small device that projected a holographic interface in the air between them. "It's okay," he said, noticing her reaction. "This is just a translation matrix. We've been analyzing your language patterns while you healed. It should help us communicate more clearly." The casual mention of healing made her mind reel. Devourer bioweapons didn't leave anything to heal. They converted living tissue into base compounds that the insects could digest. There should have been nothing left of her but processed nutrients and empty armor. She forced her voice to work, managed to croak out a single word in her native language. "How?" The translation device picked up the sound and converted it to standard galactic, though she noticed Marcus had answered her in accented but functional Kethmori. He had been learning her language while she was unconscious. "How are you alive?" he said, translating her question back to confirm his understanding. "That's complicated. We got to you just in time, but barely. Another few minutes and even our medical technology wouldn't have been able to help you." "Devourers," she managed, the word coming out as barely a whisper.
"Where?"
Something changed in Marcus's expression. The gentle concern remained, but underneath it she could see something that made her understand why the galaxy feared his species. Cold, implacable fury that burned like stellar fire. This was what humans looked like when they were thinking about war. "Gone," he said simply. "We dealt with them." The casual way he said it sent chills down her carapace. An entire devourer swarm, the nightmare that had consumed her civilization and dozens of others, dismissed with 2 words. "We dealt with them," as if they had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience rather than an extinction-level threat. "My fleet," she whispered, though she already knew the answer. Marcus's expression softened again, and she could see real sympathy in those impossible blue eyes. "I'm sorry. We were too late to save them." "You're the only survivor we found." The words hit her like a physical blow. She had known, of course, had watched her people die one by one through the tactical displays, but hearing it confirmed by this gentle stranger made it real in a way that statistics and sensor readings never could. She was alone, The last Kethmori in a universe that no longer had room for her species. Tears began to flow from her eyes, luminescent drops that traced glowing paths down her purple carapace. She had held them back during the battle, had maintained her dignity in the face of extinction, but now the grief came flooding out like a dam bursting. Marcus reached out instinctively, then stopped himself, his hand hovering uncertainly in the space between them. She could see him struggling with something, some internal debate about proper protocol or appropriate boundaries. Would it be okay if He began, then seemed to give up on words entirely. You shouldn't have to be alone right now. Without waiting for permission, he gently placed his hand over hers. The contact sent shockwaves through her consciousness. Human touch, the touch of the galaxy's most feared predator, was warm and impossibly gentle. His skin was soft, despite obvious calluses that spoke of hard work and harder training. The comfort was immediate and overwhelming. In her culture, physical contact between strangers was formal and ritualized, governed by thousands of years of protocol and tradition. This was something entirely different, an instinctive gesture of compassion that transcended species barriers. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly, and she could hear genuine pain in his voice. "I'm sorry we weren't here sooner. I'm sorry we couldn't save them. You shouldn't have had to go through that alone." The apology broke something inside her that had been holding back the full weight of her loss. She began to sob, great racking cries that shook her entire body. All the grief she had suppressed during the battle, all the fear and anger and hopeless rage, came pouring out in a flood of emotion that left her gasping. Marcus didn't try to stop her or offer empty comfort. He simply sat there, his hand warm and steady on hers, letting her mourn in whatever way she needed. Occasionally he would murmur soft words in his own language, sounds that she didn't understand but somehow found soothing. When the worst of it had passed, she found herself looking up at him with new understanding. This was not the monster from the stories. This was something else entirely, something the legends had never accounted for. A predator, yes, but one capable of unexpected gentleness, a warrior who could show mercy. "Why?" she asked when she could finally speak again. "Why save me?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer. When he spoke, his words were simple but carried weight that suggested deeper complexities. "Because no one should die alone," he said. "Because you are fighting for something worth protecting. Because," he paused, seeming to struggle with concepts that his language couldn't quite express. "Because it was the right thing to do." Such a simple concept, yet it explained everything and nothing about humanity's intervention in a war that should have been over before they arrived. The most dangerous species in the galaxy had risked themselves to save a single stranger, not for territory or resources or strategic advantage, but because it was right. "Your people," she said slowly, testing each word as the translation matrix processed it. "The stories say—" "I know what the stories say," Marcus replied with a sad smile. "Some of them are true. Some of them aren't. We're not saints, Commander. We're not heroes. We're just us. And sometimes us is enough." As if summoned by his words, she became aware of other sounds in the background. Voices speaking in human languages, the hum of advanced technology, the subtle vibrations of a ship moving through space at high velocity. She was aboard a human vessel surrounded by the galaxy's most feared predators, and she had never felt safer in her life. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Home," Marcus said simply. "To Earth. Our doctors want to make sure you're completely healed, and our xenobiologists are fascinated by your species. If you're willing, they'd like to learn about your people. To make sure they're remembered." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Her entire civilization reduced to archive data and scholarly research. But it was more than the Devourers would have left behind, more than any other species had ever offered her people. "Will you stay?" she asked, the words coming out before she could stop them. "While I heal?" Marcus smiled, and for the first time since awakening, Zixthara felt something other than grief. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe just the simple comfort of knowing she wasn't alone in an empty universe. "Yeah," he said. "I'll stay." Outside the medical bay's windows, stars wheeled by in patterns she had never seen before, carrying her toward a world that existed in legend and nightmare. But here, in this moment, with a human's gentle hand holding hers, the future didn't seem quite so dark. She closed her eyes again, not to die this time, but to rest, to heal. To let herself believe that perhaps the worst was over. Perhaps it was time to learn what happened after the end of everything. 3 days had passed since Zixthara first opened her eyes aboard the human vessel, and each day brought revelations that challenged everything she thought she knew about the galaxy's most feared species. The ship itself was a contradiction wrapped in impossibility, defying every assumption her people had made about human technology and culture. She had expected a warship built for destruction, something dark and menacing that reflected humanity's reputation for violence. Instead, she found herself aboard what could only be described as a floating city, filled with gardens, art galleries, recreation areas, and spaces designed purely for comfort and beauty. The corridors were wide and airy, lined with viewing ports that offered spectacular vistas of stars and nebulae. Marcus had given her a wheelchair while her legs recovered their strength, and, together, they had begun exploring the ship that he called the Harmony. The name itself seemed like a deliberate joke, a vessel of war named for peace. But as they traveled through section after section of unexpected wonders, she began to understand that the joke was on everyone who thought they understood humanity. "Your people built this for war?" she asked as they entered what Marcus called the Botanical Gardens. The space was enormous, several decks high and filled with plants from dozens of different worlds. The air here was sweet with the scent of flowers she didn't recognize, and small birds flew freely among branches that shouldn't have been able to exist in the metal confines of a spacecraft. "We built it for life," Marcus corrected, guiding her wheelchair along a path that wound between artificial streams and carefully tended groves. "The war part is just something it can do when necessary. But we spend most of our time out here exploring, studying, trying to understand the universe better." The distinction seemed important to him, though she wasn't sure she understood it fully. Her people had built ships with specific purposes: exploration vessels, cargo haulers, warships. The concept of a single ship designed to fulfill multiple roles simultaneously was alien to Kethmori thinking. They passed a group of humans tending to what appeared to be a grove of trees from Earth, their leaves changing color in patterns that created living art. The gardeners looked up as they passed, offering friendly waves and curious glances at the ship's unusual passenger. None of them seemed afraid of her, despite her clearly alien appearance. "Are they not concerned?" she asked. "I am a stranger from another species." Marcus looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Why would they be concerned? You're hurt and far from home. If anything, they're probably wondering if there's anything they can do to help make you more comfortable." The casual generosity still amazed her. In her experience, first contact between species was a delicate process involving extensive protocols, security measures, and careful diplomatic negotiations. Here, she was being treated like a welcome guest rather than a potential threat. As they continued through the gardens, she noticed something that made her pause. Among the earth plants and exotic specimens from other worlds, there were several species she recognized. Crystalline flowers that grew only on Kethmori colony worlds, their prismatic petals casting rainbow patterns on the deck. "How do you have these?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus followed her gaze, and his expression grew solemn. "We've been tracking the Devourers for longer than you might think. When we found worlds they had consumed, we tried to save what we could. Seeds, genetic samples, cultural artifacts. It's not much, but we wanted to make sure something survived." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Humanity had been watching the Devourers advance across the galaxy, collecting remnants of civilizations that the swarm had destroyed. These flowers might be the last of their kind in the universe, preserved by strangers who had never met her people but had cared enough to try to save something of their legacy. "Why didn't you help sooner?" The question came out more accusatory than she had intended, but Marcus didn't seem to take offense. "We weren't strong enough," he said simply. 20 years ago, we would have died alongside your people. The Devourers had numbers and biotechnology that we couldn't match. We needed time to develop countermeasures, to build ships that could survive their weapons, to learn how to fight something that had consumed a dozen civilizations. 20 years. Her people had been fighting the Devourers for decades, holding the line against extinction while humanity prepared for a war they weren't even part of. The thought should have made her angry, but instead she found herself wondering what it must have been like for the humans. Watching civilizations fall while being unable to help, knowing that their turn would come eventually. "The guilt," Marcus continued quietly, "it eats at you. Every world we couldn't save, every species we arrived too late to help. The botanists here, they volunteer for this duty specifically so they can preserve something of what we've lost. It's their way of honoring the dead." They sat in silence for a while, watching the alien flowers catch and scatter the ship's artificial sunlight. Around them, the gardens hummed with life that defied the cold vacuum of space, a testament to humanity's determination to carry beauty with them into the darkness. "Would you like to see the archives?" Marcus asked eventually. "I think you might find them meaningful." The archives turned out to be even more overwhelming than the gardens. Floor after floor of carefully preserved artifacts, genetic samples, cultural databases, and artistic works from civilizations that no longer existed. Each section was maintained with religious care, climate-controlled and monitored by systems that ensured nothing would be lost to time or accident. She found herself in the Kethmori section, staring at displays that contained fragments of her people's heritage. Poetry written in crystalline script that sang when touched by light. Mathematical proofs that had taken her greatest minds centuries to develop. Children's toys that had somehow survived the destruction of entire worlds. "We have full genetic sequences for most of your flora and fauna," Marcus explained as they moved through the displays. "When we reach Earth, our xenobiologists can begin the process of restoration. Not the same as having the original worlds, but at least the species won't be extinct." The casual mention of resurrection made her head spin. "You can bring them back? My people's plants and animals?" "Most of them, yes. We've gotten quite good at genetic restoration over the years. It's become something of a specialty among our scientists." He paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "We can't bring back your people, though. We've tried, but sapient consciousness doesn't work the same way. Once it's gone, it's gone." The statement hung between them like a weight. She had known, of course, that her people were truly dead, but hearing it confirmed by someone with the technology to reshape genes and resurrect species made it feel final in a way that mere extinction hadn't. "However," Marcus continued carefully, "we do have something else. Would you like to see?" He led her to a special section of the archives, one that required his biometric signature to enter. Inside, she found something that made her 3 hearts stop beating for a moment. A perfect recreation of a Kethmori memory chamber, built using human technology but following the exact specifications of her people's most sacred spaces. "We found the remains of your crystal archive on Kethmoris Prime," Marcus explained as she stared at the impossible sight. "Most of it was destroyed, but our technicians were able to recover fragments. We've been working to restore what we can." The Crystal Archive. The repository of her people's entire history, containing millions of years of accumulated knowledge, art, philosophy, and memory. She had assumed it was lost forever when the Devourers consumed the homeworld, but here it was, or at least pieces of it, glowing with the familiar blue-white light that had illuminated her childhood. "We've only restored about 12% so far," Marcus said, "but what we found is extraordinary. Your people's understanding of quantum mathematics alone has revolutionized our physics department." She moved closer to the crystal formations, recognizing the harmonics that indicated active data storage. This wasn't just a museum piece, it was a functional archive containing actual memories and knowledge from her people. The last repository of Kethmori civilization, maintained by aliens who had every reason to let it stay dead. "Why?" she asked, the question that had been haunting her for days. "Why do all this? Why preserve our history? Why care about species you've never met?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the crystal light in patterns that reminded her of deep water. When he spoke, his words carried a weight that suggested they came from the core of human philosophy. "Because we've been where you are," he said. "Not exactly, but close enough. There was a time when humanity almost went extinct. War, disease, environmental collapse, we nearly destroyed ourselves completely. We know what it's like to be the last of something precious." He gestured at the crystal formations around them. "We survived because we had help. Not from another species, but from each other. People who chose to preserve knowledge instead of using it for destruction. People who planted trees they would never see grow. People who believed that the future could be better than the present. And now you do the same for others. We try. It doesn't always work. Sometimes we arrive too late. Sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes the universe just doesn't cooperate. But we try, because that's what our ancestors would have wanted us to do." The simple statement carried implications that reframed everything she thought she knew about humanity. These weren't the mindless destroyers of legend, driven by base instincts and violent urges. They were a species that had stared into their own extinction and chosen compassion over conquest, preservation over dominance. As they stood in the restored archive, surrounded by fragments of her people's greatest achievements, she began to understand something that no Kethmori had ever realized. Humanity wasn't feared because they were evil or destructive. They were feared because they were effective. When they decided something needed to be protected, they protected it with a ferocity that made the Devourers look timid. "The stories," she said slowly, "about your species being monsters, are they true?" Marcus's expression darkened slightly. and she caught a glimpse of something that reminded her why the galaxy whispered humanity's name in terror. "When we need to be," he said quietly. "When someone threatens what we've sworn to protect, the Devourers learned that lesson 3 days ago." The casual threat made her shiver, but not from fear, from gratitude. Somewhere in the galaxy, an entire swarm of world killers had discovered that humanity's reputation for violence wasn't exaggerated. They had learned what happened when predators met an apex predator that had learned the value of mercy. "What happens now?" she asked. "After we reach Earth?" "That's up to you," Marcus said. "You're welcome to stay as long as you like. Our xenobiologists would love to work with you on restoration projects. Our historians want to learn everything they can about Kethmori culture. Our philosophers are fascinated by your people's approach to quantum consciousness." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "But if you want something else, we can help with that too. There are colony worlds on the rim where you could start fresh. Planets where the restored Kethmori flora and fauna could flourish again. You wouldn't be rebuilding your old civilization, but you could create something new." The offer was beyond generous. Not just survival, but the chance to ensure that her people's legacy lived on in some form. But there was something else in his voice, something hopeful that he was trying not to show. "What would you prefer?" she asked. Marcus smiled, and she realized that somewhere during their conversation she had started thinking of that expression as something warm rather than threatening. "Honestly, I'd love it if you stayed. The Harmony feels more like home when there are people aboard who understand what we're trying to do." As they made their way back through the ship's corridors, past the impossible gardens and friendly strangers, Zixthara found herself considering possibilities she had never imagined. She was the last Kethmori, but perhaps that didn't have to mean the end of everything her people had stood for. Perhaps it could be the beginning of something new. Outside the viewing ports, the stars continued their ancient dance, carrying them toward a world that had become legend among the civilizations of the galaxy. But for the first time since her people's extinction, she wasn't afraid of what she might find there. After all, she had already found the monsters of human legend, and they had turned out to be the kindest people she had ever met. Earth defied every expectation Zixthara had formed during her journey through human space. As the Harmony approached humanity's homeworld, she had prepared herself for a fortress planet bristling with weapons, its surface scarred by the industrial complexes needed to fuel an interstellar war machine. What she saw instead was a blue-green jewel that seemed to glow with its own inner light, wrapped in clouds that moved in patterns too beautiful to be natural. "It's magnificent," she breathed, watching the planet grow larger on the main viewer. From orbit, she could see vast forests, pristine oceans, and cities that seemed to blend seamlessly with the natural landscape rather than dominating it. "We've learned to take better care of it over the years," Marcus said, standing beside her wheelchair in the observation deck. "Our ancestors nearly destroyed it once. We decided not to make that mistake again." The approaching traffic around Earth was unlike anything in her experience. Ships moved in carefully orchestrated patterns, but there was none of the military precision she expected from humanity's most important world. Instead, vessels of dozens of different designs shared space lanes in what appeared to be organized chaos. Cargo haulers moved alongside research vessels, diplomatic ships shared approach vectors with obvious pleasure craft, and everywhere she looked she saw evidence of a thriving, diverse civilization. "How many different ship designs do you have?" she asked, watching a particularly unusual vessel that seemed to be built more for beauty than function. "Thousands," Marcus replied casually. "We don't really do standardization the way other species do. Every colony, every research station, every family business has their own ideas about how ships should work. The only requirement is that they meet safety standards and don't interfere with other traffic." The concept was alien to Kethmori thinking. Her people had developed optimal designs through careful analysis and had stuck with them for centuries. The idea of letting individual creativity drive such important decisions seemed inefficient at best, dangerous at worst. As if reading her thoughts, Marcus continued, "It drives our military planners crazy sometimes, but it has advantages. Enemy forces never know exactly what they're facing because every human ship is unique. The Devourers had prepared for our standard military vessels, but they weren't ready for converted mining ships using improvised weapons or research vessels that had been modified for combat. The landing at Earth's primary spaceport was an education in itself. The facility was enormous, but unlike the sterile efficiency of Kethmori ports, this one buzzed with life and color. Humans moved through the terminal in streams of organized chaos, their clothing representing dozens of different styles and their conversations creating a polyglot symphony of languages and accents. But it wasn't just humans. As Marcus helped her from the shuttle into a more advanced mobility chair designed specifically for her physiology, Zixthara saw representatives of at least 6 different species moving freely through the crowds. Tall, crystalline beings that might have been Veltari, short, stocky creatures that could have been from the Outer Rim colonies, even what appeared to be a group of energy beings maintaining semi-solid forms through technological assistance. Earth is a diplomatic center as well as our homeworld, Marcus explained, noticing her amazement. We host refugees from about 40 different civilizations, plus diplomatic missions from most of the major powers. It gets complicated sometimes, but we've found that diversity makes us stronger. The statement carried implications that challenged everything she thought she knew about interspecies relations. The galactic norm was careful isolation, with contact limited to formal diplomatic channels and heavily regulated trade agreements. The idea of dozens of species living together on a single world seemed like a recipe for conflict. Yet as they moved through the terminal, she saw no evidence of tension or hostility. A group of human children was playing with young beings from at least 3 other species, their game involving rules that seemed to accommodate everyone's different abilities. Nearby, adults from multiple civilizations were engaged in animated conversations that appeared to be purely social rather than diplomatic. "How do you manage it?" she asked. "The cultural differences, the biological incompatibilities, the competing interests." Marcus considered the question as they boarded a transport that would take them to the Xenobiological Research Institute. "We started with the assumption that it couldn't work," he said finally, "which meant we had to figure out ways to make it work anyway. Turns out that when you expect problems, you get better at solving them. The journey through Earth's landscape was another revelation." From the spaceport, she could see cities that seemed to grow organically from the terrain, their architecture following natural contours rather than imposing geometric order. Transportation moved through area lanes that avoided disturbing the forests and parks that covered most of the visible surface. "Your population?" she asked, trying to estimate the numbers needed to support interstellar civilization. "About 12 billion, spread across the planet and our orbital habitats," Marcus replied. "We learned a long time ago that cramming everyone into megacities wasn't sustainable. Most people live in communities of a few 100,000, connected by high-speed transport but maintaining their own local character. 12 billion. The number was staggering. The entire Kethmori civilization at its height had numbered perhaps 3 billion across dozens of worlds. Yet Earth seemed uncrowded, its cities integrated with natural landscapes in ways that spoke of careful planning and deep respect for the environment. The Xenobiological Research Institute turned out to be a complex of interconnected buildings that resembled a university campus more than a scientific facility. Gardens and open spaces were everywhere, with researchers of multiple species moving between labs and offices in an atmosphere of casual collaboration. Dr. Sarah Chen, Marcus's sister and the Institute's director of restoration biology, met them at the entrance. She was older than Marcus, her hair showing silver streaks, but she had the same warm expression and the same unsettling ability to treat alien contact as if it were completely normal. "Commander Zixthara," she said, offering what appeared to be a human greeting gesture that had been modified to accommodate Kethmori physiology. "Welcome to Earth. My brother has told me so much about you. The family resemblance was strong, but where Marcus carried himself with the controlled alertness of a military officer, Sarah had the slightly distracted air of someone whose mind was constantly engaged with complex problems. Her clothing was practical but showed signs of recent contact with biological specimens, and her hands bore the small scars that came from working with unpredictable organisms. "We've made significant progress on the Kethmori restoration project," she continued as they entered the Institute's main building. "Would you like to see..." The restoration labs were unlike anything Zixthara had ever imagined. Vast chambers held carefully controlled environments that mimicked dozens of different planetary conditions. In one section, she recognized the distinctive blue-green glow of Kethmori photosynthetic organisms. In another, small creatures that looked like the crystalline insects that had pollinated her homeworld's gardens moved through artificial flower beds. "We've successfully restored about 60% of your people's botanical database," Dr. Chen explained, leading them through the growing chambers. "The zoological samples were more challenging, but we're making progress. These little fellows were actually extinct even on your homeworld, but we found genetic samples in some very old artifacts." She watched in amazement as tiny creatures that she remembered from childhood stories flew between flowers that had grown in her grandmother's garden, species that had been lost for centuries, brought back to life by aliens who had never seen them alive. "The plan," Dr. Chen continued, "is to establish breeding populations of all the major species, then gradually introduce them to suitable worlds. We've identified 17 planets that could support Kethmori ecosystems with minimal terraforming. 17 worlds. Her people's legacy could live on across 17 different planets, tended by humans who understood the value of biodiversity. The gift was so enormous that she struggled to find words adequate to express her gratitude. Why? She asked, the question that had become central to her understanding of humanity. Why devote such resources to restoring another species' heritage? Chen's expression grew thoughtful as she watched the artificial creatures tend their artificial gardens. My great-grandmother was one of the last speakers of Mandarin Chinese before the language revival programs, she said. For 50 years she was the only person in our family who could read our ancestors' poetry in the original script. She paused to adjust an environmental control that would optimize growing conditions for a particularly delicate flower species. When she died, we thought that connection was lost forever. But the revival programs brought the language back, and now my daughter can read those same poems. She understands things about our heritage that would have been lost without preservation efforts. The connection took Zixthara a moment to process. You see our species as similar to your cultural heritage? I see all species as irreplaceable repositories of knowledge and beauty, Dr. Chen replied. When we lose a language, we lose unique ways of understanding the universe. When we lose a species, we lose millions of years of evolutionary problem-solving. When we lose a civilization, we lose perspectives that can never be recreated. They moved to another section of the lab where human technicians worked alongside researchers from other species, sharing techniques and insights in an atmosphere of collaborative discovery. Zixthara noticed that the humans seemed to default to a teaching role, explaining their methods and encouraging questions rather than treating their knowledge as proprietary. Your people share technology freely? She asked. Information wants to be shared, Marcus replied. Keeping scientific knowledge secret might give temporary advantages, but in the long run it slows down progress for everyone. We learned that lesson during our near-extinction period. The casual reference to humanity's brush with extinction reminded her that these people understood loss in ways that went beyond academic sympathy. They had faced the possibility of becoming extinct themselves, which gave their preservation efforts a personal dimension that purely altruistic motivations couldn't match. That evening, Marcus took her to his family home, a modest dwelling that overlooked one of Earth's Great Lakes. The house was built into a hillside using materials that seemed to blend stone, metal, and living wood in ways that created a structure that felt both permanent and organic. His parents were waiting to meet her, along with what appeared to be an extended family that included aunts, uncles, cousins, and children ranging from infants to teenagers. The gathering had the casual warmth of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company rather than the formal obligation of traditional family ceremonies. We wanted to thank you, Marcus's mother said as they sat on a terrace overlooking the lake. Marcus told us how bravely you fought, how you protected your people until the end. That kind of courage deserves recognition. The statement confused her. I failed. My people are extinct. Your people are remembered, Marcus's father corrected gently. Their knowledge lives on, their beauty is preserved, their courage is honored. That's not failure. That's the best kind of immortality. As the evening progressed and Earth's sun set over the lake in shades of gold and crimson, Zixthara found herself part of conversations that ranged from complex scientific theories to silly jokes that lost something in translation but remained funny somehow. The children were particularly fascinated by her appearance, asking innocent questions about her carapace and her multiple hearts with the sort of direct curiosity that only young minds could manage. Do you dream in colors? One little girl asked, her eyes wide with wonder. I dream in harmonics, Zixthara replied, then spent several minutes trying to explain the concept of visual music to an 8-year-old human. Later, as the family moved inside to continue their gathering, she found herself alone on the terrace with Marcus. The lake reflected the first stars of evening, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of earth creatures beginning their nighttime songs. Your family, she said. They accepted me immediately. No fear, no suspicion, no questions about my intentions. They trust my judgment, Marcus said simply. And they understand what it means to be far from home. The trust was absolute and unquestioning, based on nothing more than one person's assessment of her character. In Kethmori society, such acceptance would have required extensive background checks, formal vouching procedures, and careful evaluation of potential risks. Here, it was simply offered as a gift. I need to ask you something, she said, gathering courage for a question that had been growing in her mind all day. The offer to help establish Kethmori colonies on those 17 worlds, what would you expect in return? Marcus looked genuinely puzzled. Nothing, he said. Why would we expect anything in return? Because nothing is free. Every transaction has costs. Every alliance requires reciprocal obligations. Your people must want something from me, from my heritage, from the knowledge we preserved. We want you to be happy, Marcus said, and the simple statement carried a sincerity that made her 3 hearts skip in unison. We want your people's legacy to continue. We want the universe to be a more beautiful and diverse place than it was yesterday. The motivation was so alien to her experience that she struggled to process it. Altruism existed in Kethmori culture, but it was balanced by practical considerations and social obligations. The idea of a civilization dedicating vast resources to preserving another species' heritage without expecting any return was beyond her comprehension. But surely there are costs, she persisted. Resources that could be used for your own people's benefit. Our people's benefit includes living in a universe worth preserving, Marcus replied. A galaxy where diversity flourishes, where knowledge is shared, where no one has to face extinction alone. That's the world we want our children to inherit. As they sat together watching the stars emerge over Earth's peaceful landscape, Zyxthera began to understand something fundamental about humanity that the galaxy's legends had completely missed. They weren't feared because they were stronger or more violent than other species. They were feared because they represented something unprecedented in galactic civilization, a predator species that had learned to protect instead of consume, to preserve instead of destroy. The devourers consumed everything they touched, turning matter into more devourers in an endless cycle of destruction. Humanity did the opposite, taking the broken remnants of destroyed civilizations and nurturing them back into something that could flourish again. I would like to see those worlds, she said quietly. The ones where my people's heritage could continue. Marcus smiled, and she realized that his expression no longer reminded her of predatory instincts. It simply looked like happiness. I was hoping you'd say that, he said. I think you're going to love what we've found. 6 months after arriving on Earth, Zyxthara stood on the observation deck of the terraforming ship New Harmony, watching as humanity's latest miracle took shape before her eyes. The world below had been a barren rock when they arrived, its atmosphere thin and its surface scarred by ancient asteroid impacts. Now it showed the first green traces of what would become a thriving ecosystem, carefully designed to support both Earth-native and Kethmori native species. The atmospheric processors are ahead of schedule, reported Dr. Rick. Elena Vasquez, the project's chief terraforming engineer. We should have breathable atmosphere in another 3 months, full ecosystem integration in 18. The preliminary surveys show excellent compatibility between the soil composition and Kethmori plant requirements. Zyxthera nodded, still amazed by the casual way humans discussed reshaping entire worlds. For her people, terraforming had been a generations-long process involving careful study and incremental changes. Humanity approached it like engineering on a planetary scale, using technologies that seemed to bend the laws of physics to their will. The crystalline forest will go here, Marcus said, indicating a vast plain that would soon be covered with the singing trees of her homeworld. He had requested transfer to the terraforming project, claiming that his skills were needed for security assessment. She suspected his real motivation was simpler. He didn't want her to face this alone. Around them, the New Harmony bustled with activity. Human engineers worked alongside specialists from a dozen other species, each bringing unique expertise to the massive undertaking. She had learned that this was typical of human projects. They rarely worked in isolation, preferring to build coalitions of species that could contribute different perspectives and abilities. The settlement site has been prepared according to Kethmori architectural principles, added Dr. James Okafor, the team's xenological consultant. We've incorporated the harmonic resonance chambers you described, along with the crystal gardens and meditation spaces. The living quarters follow traditional family group arrangements, but we've added modern amenities for comfort. The settlement existed only in holographic projections for now, but Zyxthara could see how carefully they had studied her people's cultural needs. The buildings would sing in the wind the way Kethmori architecture was meant to, their crystalline components catching and amplifying sound to create the symphonies that her people had considered essential to mental health. You've thought of everything, she said, and meant it. The level of detail in the planning was extraordinary, going far beyond basic survival needs to encompass the aesthetic and spiritual requirements that made life worth living. We had a good consultant, Marcus said with a smile. Someone who understands what makes a place feel like home, instead of just a place to exist. The past 6 months had been the strangest and most fulfilling period of Zyxthara's life. She had worked with human scientists to decode the remaining fragments of the Crystal Archive, sharing not just the technical knowledge of her people, but their art, their philosophy, their approaches to understanding the universe. In return, she had learned about humanity's own journey from near extinction to galactic influence. The humans, she discovered, had indeed almost destroyed themselves. War, environmental collapse, and social fragmentation had brought them to the brink of extinction less than 2 centuries ago. Their survival had been a near miracle of cooperation and determination, requiring them to fundamentally reimagine their relationship with each other and their environment. We learned that survival isn't enough, Dr. Chen had told her during one of their many conversations. Living requires hope, beauty, purpose. When we rebuilt our civilization, we tried to build those things into the foundation, rather than treating them as luxuries. The result was a species that approached galactic civilization with a perspective shaped by loss and renewal. They understood extinction as a real possibility rather than an abstract concept, which gave them a visceral appreciation for preservation efforts that other species might consider wasteful or sentimental. "Incoming transmission from Earth," announced the ship's communication officer. "It's Admiral Harrison with an update on the Devourer situation." The main viewer switched to show a woman in her 60s, her gray hair pulled back severely, but her expression carrying the same warmth that seemed characteristic of humans in leadership positions. Admiral Harrison had been coordinating humanity's response to the Devourer threat, a task that apparently involved tracking down and eliminating every remaining fragment of the swarm. "Commander Zixthara," the Admiral said, "I have good news. Our deep space patrols have confirmed the elimination of the last Devourer nest ship. The threat that destroyed your people has been permanently neutralized." The words should have brought satisfaction, even relief. The creatures responsible for the extinction of her entire civilization were gone, their endless hunger finally sated by death. Instead, she felt a strange emptiness, as if an important chapter of her life had closed without resolution. "How many of them were there?" she asked. "Final count is 7,430, 2 individual ships, ranging from scout vessels to hive queens the size of small moons," the Admiral replied. "They had been active for approximately 800 years, consuming resources from at least 43 different civilizations. 43 civilizations. The number was staggering. Her people had been just one entry in a catalog of extinction that spanned centuries and light years. The Devourers had been a cancer on the galaxy, consuming everything in their path with mindless efficiency. The restoration projects for the other species are proceeding as planned," Admiral Harrison continued. "We've established contact with survivor populations from 6 different civilizations, including a group of Valteri refugees who are hiding in a rogue planet system. They'll be joining you on New Cathmoris once the terraforming is complete." New Cathmoris. They had given her world a name that honored her people's heritage while acknowledging that it was something new rather than a recreation of what had been lost. The subtle distinction mattered more than she had expected. "There's something else," the Admiral said, her expression growing more serious. "The Galactic Council has requested a formal meeting. They want to discuss humanity's intervention in what they consider internal galactic affairs." Marcus's expression darkened. "They're complaining that we stopped a genocide? They're nervous about our military capabilities and our willingness to use them without permission," the Admiral replied diplomatically. "Apparently single-handedly destroying a threat that had been terrorizing the galaxy for centuries has made some people uncomfortable. The politics of galactic civilization had never made sense to Zixthara, but this seemed particularly absurd. Humanity had eliminated a threat that every other species had been unable or unwilling to confront, and the response was criticism rather than gratitude. "What will you tell them?" she asked. Admiral Harrison's smile was pleasant and completely terrifying. "That we acted to protect threatened species in accordance with our own laws and moral principles. If they have a problem with that, they're welcome to establish enforcement mechanisms that don't require waiting for civilizations to go extinct before taking action." The polite dismissal carried implications that made Zixthara understand why the galaxy's established powers found humanity so disturbing. They weren't asking for permission to do what they thought was right, and they weren't particularly concerned about diplomatic consequences. After the transmission ended, she found herself standing at the viewing port again, watching the slow transformation of the world below. In a few months, she would walk on its surface, breathe its atmosphere, and begin the process of building something that honored her people's memory while creating new possibilities for the future.
"Nervous?"
Marcus asked, joining her at the window. "Excited," she replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. "For the first time since the war began, I'm looking forward to tomorrow instead of dreading it." "Good," Marcus said. "That's what hope feels like. It's been a while since you had reason to feel it. Hope. Such a simple concept, yet it had been absent from her life for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like." The Kethmori had fought for survival, for honor, for duty. But hope? That had died with the first worlds, crushed under the weight of inevitable defeat. "Your people," she said slowly, "you've given me something I thought was lost forever. Not just survival, not just preservation, but the possibility of a future worth living in." "You gave us something too," Marcus replied, "a reminder of why we do this work. Why we choose protection over conquest, preservation over exploitation. Seeing you find hope again, that's worth more than any military victory." As they watched, a transport ship descended toward the planet's surface, carrying the latest shipment of restored organisms to the growing ecosystem below. Somewhere in its cargo holds were creatures that had been extinct for centuries, plants that would soon sing in alien winds, and the genetic foundation for a world where beauty and diversity could flourish. "The children," Zixthera said suddenly. "When families begin settling on New Kethmoris, there will be children who grow up never knowing that their species was once extinct. They'll take this world for granted the way I took my homeworld for granted." "That's the point," Marcus said gently. "The goal isn't to preserve tragedy. It's to make tragedy unnecessary." The simple statement reframed everything she understood about humanity's approach to galactic civilization. They weren't trying to be saviors or conquerors or even protectors in the traditional sense. They were trying to create conditions where such roles weren't needed, where species could flourish without fear of extinction. "I want to help," she said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke, "not just with New Kethmoris, but with the other restoration projects. The other survivors who need what you gave me." Marcus's smile was warm enough to melt stellar ice. "I was hoping you'd say that. The Velteri refugees are going to need someone who understands what they're going through, and we've received signals from what might be another survivor population in the Andromeda Galaxy. Another survivor population, more species that have faced extinction and somehow endured. More opportunities to turn loss into renewal, despair into hope. The work would be endless, but for the first time and longer than she could remember, that didn't seem like a burden. There's something else," Marcus added, his expression growing more serious. "The council meeting that Admiral Harrison mentioned. They're going to want to understand humanity's intentions, our long-term goals. It would help to have testimony from someone who's experienced our methods firsthand." The request was carefully phrased, but she understood the implications. The galaxy's powers wanted to know whether humanity represented a threat to the established order. Her words could influence how the rest of galactic civilization viewed Earth's growing influence. "What would you like me to tell them?" she asked. "The truth," Marcus said simply. "Whatever you think that is." The trust was absolute and unconditional. Exactly what she had come to expect from humanity. They were asking her to speak for them without trying to control or influence what she said. The contrast with traditional diplomatic practices was stark. "I'll tell them that you're the most dangerous species in the galaxy," she said, watching Marcus's expression carefully, "because you make extinction impossible. You turn loss into renewal, despair into hope, endings into beginnings. You're dangerous to anyone who profits from suffering or builds power on the assumption that nothing can change." Marcus laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement. "That should make for an interesting diplomatic session." "Good," Zixthara replied. "It's time the galaxy learned that some changes are worth making." Below them, New Kethmoris continued its transformation from barren rock to living world. In the growing green patches on its surface, she could see the future taking shape. Not a recreation of what had been lost, but something new and beautiful that honored the past while embracing possibilities that had never existed before. She closed her eyes, not to die this time, but to imagine. To envision a galaxy where no species faced extinction alone, where diversity flourished under the protection of those strong enough to enforce it, where the future was always brighter than the past. When she opened them again, Marcus was still there, still watching over her with the same gentle attention he had shown since pulling her from the wreckage of everything she had once known. But now she understood what she was seeing in his expression. Not pity or duty or even compassion, though all of those were present. She was seeing love. Not romantic love, but something deeper and more universal. The love that drove parents to plant trees for children not yet born. The love that motivated strangers to preserve the heritage of extinct species. The love that turned apex predators into gardeners of galaxies. "Thank you," she said, the words encompassing everything she couldn't express. "For saving me. For saving my people's legacy. For showing me that hope isn't just possible, it's inevitable." "Thank you," Marcus replied, "for reminding us why we fight. Not for territory or resources or power, but for moments like this, for the chance to see beauty preserved and hope restored. As the new Harmony continued its orbit around the world that would soon be home to the first Kefmori born in a universe without devourers, Zixthara felt something she had thought lost forever. Not just hope for survival, but excitement for the future. Anticipation for discoveries not yet made, relationships not yet formed, beauty not yet created. She had closed her eyes to die and opened them to find a human holding her. Now she kept them open to see the galaxy that humanity was helping to build. A galaxy where extinction was temporary but beauty was eternal, where loss led to renewal and despair gave way to hope. It was, she realized, exactly the kind of universe worth preserving, and she was going to spend the rest of her extended life helping them build it.